Far away from Earth, beyond the edge of known space, a lone human lived among creatures that once made the bravest soldiers tremble. Her name was Dr. Elena Moore, a biologist who had left behind the comfort of her world to study life on a planet called Threxia, home to the Kareth, a species once known across the stars for their power, sharp instincts, and ruthless history in war. Their scaled skin shimmered under the twin suns, their golden eyes sharp as blades. But Elena didn't come to fight or fear them. She came to understand them. Her small cabin stood on the edge of their settlement, surrounded by tall black stone towers that the Kareth built from the bones of the mountains. Each day she walked among them, writing notes, observing rituals, trying to understand what made these predators live, think, and feel. Most of the adult Kareth kept their distance. They didn't trust easily, especially not a human. To them she was soft, fragile, strange, a creature too quiet for survival. When she passed, they would watch her with curious but cautious eyes. Yet Elena never showed fear. She greeted them politely, shared her food, and helped their healers with small tasks. Slowly, she became a part of their world, even if from a distance. But it wasn't the adults who paid her the most attention. It was the cubs. Small, curious, and full of energy, they followed her wherever she went, always from a few steps behind. They would giggle in their guttural language when she tripped on the uneven paths or when she tried to copy their greetings. At first, she ignored the stares, pretending not to notice the little faces peeking from behind rocks and doorways. But as the days turned into weeks, their curiosity grew bolder. They began creeping closer, leaving little gifts, shiny stones, feathers, and bits of carved wood outside her door. At night, when the moons of Threxia rose high, Elena would return to her cabin, exhausted but content. She would light a small lamp, take off her helmet, and brush the dust from her hair with an old wooden brush she had brought from Earth. It was a simple habit, something she had done since childhood. To her, it was a small comfort, a way to hold on to the pieces of home she had left behind. But she didn't know that, just beyond the glass of her window, 3 small pairs of glowing eyes were watching. The Kareth cubs crouched outside, their scaled faces pressed to the window pane. They whispered softly to each other, fascinated by the strange human ritual. The smooth strokes of the brush through her hair, the calm look on her face, the soft sound of bristles against strands. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. To them, grooming was quick, rough, practical. But this human made it look like something sacred. They didn't understand it yet, but in that quiet moment, under the alien moons, something small but powerful began, a spark of connection between 2 very different worlds. The evening air on Threxia carried a soft hum, the sound of alien insects and the low crackle of distant fires. The twin moons hung over the horizon, casting silver light across the rocky camp. Inside her small cabin, Elena sat at her desk, surrounded by scattered notes, samples, and the quiet hum of her research tools. It had been another long day working with the Kareth tribe, learning their speech, watching their hunting rituals, and recording their complex social behaviors. Her hands were tired, her mind full, and her body longed for stillness. She placed her journal aside and picked up the small wooden brush from her bedside. It was old, the handle smooth from years of use, one of the few items she had brought from Earth. To her, brushing her hair wasn't just about tidying up. It was something that reminded her she was still human in a place so far from home. She sat before the small mirror propped on the wall and began to brush slowly, each stroke long and rhythmic. The sound was soft, bristles against strands, a simple whisper that filled the silence. Her reflection looked tired but peaceful. In that small ritual, she found comfort. It was a moment where everything, the noise, the fear, the loneliness, faded away. Outside, just beyond the cabin's door, 3 Kareth cubs crouched in the shadows. They had followed her again, as they often did. Their large eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, scales shimmering under the silver glow. But tonight they were unusually quiet. They peeked through a small opening, watching the strange human with fascination. What was she doing? They had seen her handle tools and machines before, but never something like this. Her hands moved slowly, tenderly, almost like she was weaving a spell. Among the Kareth, grooming was a necessity, a harsh, practical act. They used their claws to scrape dust and grit from their armored skin. It was rough, quick, and without emotion. But what Elena did was different. There was care in every motion, patience in every movement. Her eyes softened, her breathing slowed, and the air around her seemed to grow lighter. It was as if she carried a piece of peace that didn't exist anywhere else on that harsh planet. The cubs whispered in their guttural tongue, their voices low and full of awe. One of them mimicked the brushing motion with his claw, scratching the air softly. Another tilted her head, trying to understand why someone would take so much time on something so small. To them, it wasn't grooming, it was art, a language made not of words or sounds, but of stillness and touch. Inside, Elena had no idea she was being watched. She brushed her hair one last time, set the brush down carefully, and sighed with quiet contentment. The moonlight painted her reflection silver, making her look almost otherworldly, a soft figure of calm in a world built on survival. Outside, the cubs watched until she turned off the light, and when she did, they lingered a little longer, their minds filled with new curiosity. That night, they didn't fall asleep easily. Something they had seen, something gentle, human, and strange, had settled deep in their young hearts. The next evening came quietly, painted in the soft silver light of Threxia's twin moons. The wind was calm, carrying the distant hum of the Kareth village as fires burned low and the creatures of the night began to stir. Inside her cabin, Elena sat by the same small mirror, her shoulders relaxed after another long day of studying and note-taking. She ran the wooden brush slowly through her hair, each motion steady and deliberate, her reflection framed by the warm glow of her lamp. It was her little world of calm, a fragile peace in a place where everything outside was harsh and untamed. But tonight, she wasn't alone. Outside, 3 small shadows moved quietly along the dirt. The Kareth cubs had returned, their curiosity stronger than their fear. They whispered to each other in low, rumbling tones, trying to stay hidden behind crates and barrels stacked near the cabin. One of them, the smallest, crept forward until he was close enough to see the human clearly through the narrow gap in the door. Her hair shimmered softly under the light, and the brush moved like it had a rhythm of its own. To his young mind, it looked like magic. Something alive, something soothing. They huddled closer, trying to see better. But in their excitement, one of the cubs accidentally brushed his tail against a metal bucket leaning against the wall. The sharp clang echoed through the quiet night. Elena jumped slightly, her brush pausing mid-air. The cubs froze. Their hearts raced as panic set in. They had been caught. In their culture, approaching an elder's private space without permission was a serious offense. They expected the human to shout, maybe even chase them away like some of the adults would, but instead, something unexpected happened. Elena slowly turned her head toward the door, her expression calm. Her eyes softened when she saw the small faces half hidden behind the crates. Instead of anger, she smiled. She held up the brush in her hand so they could see it clearly, her voice gentle and steady. "It's okay," she said softly. "It doesn't hurt." The cubs looked at each other in disbelief. The human wasn't angry, and she was inviting them closer. Slowly, they inched forward, their claws clicking lightly on the stone floor. Elena didn't move suddenly or speak too fast. She simply waited, keeping her hand open. When they finally reached the door, she kneeled so she was closer to their height and turned the brush in her fingers so the light caught on its bristles. She ran it through her hair again, demonstrating slowly, then offered it toward them. The cubs stared, their golden eyes wide. They had been told humans were fragile, easily frightened, easily hurt. But this one wasn't. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation in her tone. She trusted them. That single gesture, a human lowering her guard, confused them more than anything they had learned before. One of the cubs leaned closer, sniffed the brush, then made a soft clicking sound that meant curiosity. Elena laughed gently. "See? It's not so strange." For the cubs, that small moment was unlike anything they had ever known. A human had faced them without fear. A human had smiled instead of running. and as they lingered near the warm glow of the cabin, something new began to take root inside them, a quiet fascination, not with science or study, but with the gentle strength of kindness. The next morning dawned pale and quiet on the planet Threxia. The air carried a faint chill, and the mist hung low over the alien stone huts. Elena stepped out of her cabin, stretching her arms after another long night of research and writing. The camp was just waking up. She could hear the distant calls of the Kareth hunters and the rhythmic clang of tools being sharpened. But something unusual caught her eye. Right outside her door, sitting cross-legged on the dusty ground, were the 3 Kareth cubs. They looked up the moment she appeared, their eyes bright and full of excitement. In their small, clawed hands, they held an assortment of strange objects, sticks, loose fibers, and a few delicate feathers they must have collected from the nearby cliffs. For a moment, Elena was confused. Then she realized what they were doing. One of the cubs, the smallest of the group, was dragging a thin twig across another's head. It caught awkwardly against the small ridges of his scales, pulling slightly, and the other cub let out a sharp hiss before bursting into laughter. The sound was rough but joyful. Elena couldn't help but smile. They were trying to copy her. She watched as they took turns, running their makeshift brushes over each other's heads with clumsy enthusiasm. The sight was both funny and touching, these little creatures, once afraid of her, now mimicking her nightly ritual. She walked closer, crouching down beside them. The cubs froze for a second, unsure of what to do. But when she smiled and gently reached out, their tension melted away. "Here," she said softly, motioning for one of them to hand her a stick. The cub hesitated, then passed it to her, his claws brushing against her fingers. Elena held the stick lightly and demonstrated a slow, gentle stroke across one cub's scaled head, careful not to press too hard. "Like this," she murmured. The cub blinked, his eyes closing slightly as if enjoying the feeling. The others leaned closer, fascinated by the careful motion. When she handed the stick back, they tried again, slower this time, copying her movements with surprising focus. The twigs didn't glide smoothly like her brush, but they didn't seem to mind. They laughed when it snagged and clicked their tongues when it worked right. One of them even placed a feather in another's crest like a crown, and the group erupted in laughter that sounded almost musical. As the sun dipped lower, the orange glow of evening fires lit the camp, reflecting in the cubs' eyes. The warmth of the flames and the easy laughter between species filled the air with something rare: comfort. Elena felt it too, that soft ache in her chest that only comes from witnessing innocence and connection. She sat with them for a long time, helping them refine their technique, showing them patience with every motion, and when she finally stood to leave, one of the cubs tugged lightly at her sleeve, handing her a feather as a gift. She smiled, tucking it into her hair. That night, when she brushed her hair inside the cabin, she could still hear faint giggles outside her door. For the first time since she arrived on Threxia, laughter, human and Kareth, blended together under the twin moons, and it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Over the next few days, something unexpected began to happen in the Kareth village. What had started as a small moment between Elena and 3 curious cubs slowly turned into something much bigger, something the whole tribe began to notice. Each evening, when the light from the twin moons spread across the red stones of the settlement, the same group of cubs would gather outside Elena's cabin, waiting eagerly. They carried their little treasures with them: sticks smoothed by sand, bits of vine tied together, and even small bones they had polished into makeshift brushes. Elena welcomed them each night with a warm smile. She would sit on the small wooden step outside her door, her own brush in hand, and begin her slow, rhythmic strokes. The cubs would sit around her in a circle, watching her carefully before starting their own motions. It became a ritual, quiet, gentle, and strangely peaceful. Their laughter softened, replaced by concentration. Some would hum softly, others would close their eyes as their friends brushed along their scales. What was once a strange act had turned into something sacred. Word spread quickly among the tribe. More cubs started to come, peeking from behind corners, then joining the circle one by one. Within a week, nearly a dozen of them gathered each evening, sitting cross-legged, their bright eyes glowing in the twilight. They carved better brushes from bone and vine, improving their craft with each passing day. Some added feathers for decoration, others engraved simple markings, patterns that symbolized friendship and calm. The adults, however, didn't quite understand. They stood at a distance, arms crossed, their tall figures half hidden in the firelight. To the Kareth, time spent not working, training, or hunting was wasted. Yet they couldn't look away. These cubs, their own children, were calmer, happier, even kinder. They had stopped bickering and fighting the way young Kareth usually did. Instead, they worked together, sharing materials, teaching each other how to be gentle without being weak. One evening, as the ritual went on, a Kareth elder approached quietly. He stood by the edge of the gathering, watching in silence. His scales glinted under the moons, his expression unreadable. Elena noticed but didn't stop. She continued brushing, her movements slow and fluid. The cubs didn't even notice the elder at first. They were too focused, too peaceful. For a species born from battle and instinct, this sight was strange. A circle of predator children sitting silently beside a human, learning patience and touch. As the wind whispered through the camp, something shifted. The elder didn't walk away. Instead, he lowered himself to sit on a nearby stone, observing quietly. His eyes softened just a little. He didn't say a word, but in that silence, an understanding began to bloom. Elena didn't realize it then, but what she had started had gone far beyond curiosity. This wasn't about hair or grooming anymore. It was about connection, about teaching a culture that had always known strength to also know softness. And for the first time in Kareth history, the sound that filled their camp at dusk wasn't that of training or argument, but the quiet, rhythmic brushing that spoke of calm, and the laughter of children learning how to be kind. The afternoon sun on Threxia burned softly through the mist, turning the rocky ground a deep shade of bronze. Elena sat outside her cabin, sorting through her notes and small samples from her field studies, when she noticed a shadow fall across her work. Looking up, she found herself face to face with one of the Kareth elders, a towering figure with dark, layered scales that shimmered like obsidian in the light. He was a respected warrior, known for his quiet authority and unmatched discipline. In one clawed hand he held something long and polished, a ceremonial comb, its surface carved with ancient Kareth symbols. It was a tool used for maintaining battle armor, not for anything as ordinary as grooming. For a long moment neither spoke. The elder's gaze was unreadable, but there was something curious in the way he looked at her. Not suspicion this time, but thought. Finally, his deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Show me," he said simply. Elena blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "You want me to show you?" she asked carefully. He gave a slow nod, his tone firm but calm. "The thing you do. The brush, the cubs, they are quieter now. Their energy is different. I wish to understand." Elena hesitated. This was not a cub. This was a warrior, a leader of his people. Yet his request wasn't one of mockery. It carried respect, even vulnerability. Gently, she took the ceremonial comb from his hand. It was heavier than her brush, designed for strength, not softness. Still, she held it delicately, as if handling something sacred. "Watch," she said softly. She ran the comb gently over her own hair, slow and rhythmic. The elder's eyes followed every motion, his pupils narrowing slightly. Then at her nod, he tried to copy her. His first movement was awkward, too rough, too quick. The comb snagged, and his scales clicked in irritation. "No," she said gently, smiling. "Not like you polish armor. Like you're speaking to it, calm, not command." She guided his hand carefully, showing him how to move with ease, not force. The change was almost immediate. His rigid shoulders relaxed, and his large hands, once trained for battle, began to move with surprising grace. The comb slid more smoothly across the surface, and his breathing slowed. For the first time, his expression softened. "So this," he murmured quietly, "calms the spirit?" Elena nodded, her smile small but sincere. "Yes," she said. "It's not just for the body, it's for the heart." He sat silently for a while, continuing the motion as if trying to memorize the feeling. The rhythmic sound of the comb filled the air, soft, steady, peaceful. When he finally stood, he bowed his head slightly before walking back toward the village. That evening, as the moons rose, something remarkable happened. Other adults began to gather outside Elena's cabin, curious. The elder had spoken. He had told them the humans' ritual brought peace, that it quieted even the sharpest mind. Soon warriors came carrying their own combs and small tools, asking to learn. The same beings who once saw gentleness as weakness now sought it out as strength. And as the night deepened, the camp of predators echoed not with the sounds of training or war, but with the steady rhythm of calm hands, a new tradition born from a single human act. Weeks turned into months on the quiet planet of Threxia, and the human scientists' small ritual began to spread like a gentle wave through the Kareth tribe. What had once been seen as strange, unnecessary, or even childish slowly became something the whole community began to cherish. The act of brushing, simple, soft, rhythmic, had taken root deep in their hearts. The cubs had started it with their laughter and curiosity, but now even the warriors, the elders, and the hunters found themselves reaching for brushes or combs before the start of each day. Elena noticed the change slowly, almost without realizing it at first. One morning, as she walked through the settlement to study the alien flora near the cliffs, she saw a young Kareth hunter sitting quietly by the water, running a carved bone comb across his scaled arms. The movements were slow and focused, his reflection shimmering on the surface. She watched from a distance, smiling softly. Later, near the central square, two Kareth women brushed each other's shoulders before heading to a council meeting, whispering calmly as they worked. It wasn't vanity. It was preparation, a way to steady the mind before facing something important. The transformation spread far beyond the children's games. Before hunts, the warriors would gather near the fire pits, brushing the fine scales along their necks and arms in silence. They said it cleared their thoughts, that it helped them hunt not with rage but with clarity. Before the elders' councils, the leaders would sit together and comb their ridges while discussing the future of their people, a gesture of respect meant to show they came with calm hearts. Even the healers began to use it before their long nights of tending to the wounded, saying it helped them keep patience. Every evening, Elena still sat outside her cabin with the cubs, the moons shining above them like twin guardians. The little ones still giggled as they brushed each other's scales, feathers, or even tails, their laughter carrying across the quiet valley. But now, that laughter no longer sounded foreign or out of place. It belonged here. The adults no longer watched from afar. Some joined in, sitting on the outer edge of the circle, brushing in silence as the children played. Elena sometimes thought about how strange it was, how something as simple as a nightly habit from Earth had become a cultural bridge between two species. She hadn't meant to teach anything. She hadn't come here to change a society. She had simply been herself, living quietly, holding on to the small parts of humanity that made her feel grounded in a foreign world. Yet somehow, those small things had spoken louder than any words ever could. The Kareth had been known across the galaxy as warriors, creatures of instinct and power. But now, they were learning something far rarer, gentleness without weakness, strength without anger. It wasn't just a ritual anymore. It was a symbol. And every time Elena looked around the camp at dusk, seeing both cubs and warriors brushing their scales under the soft moonlight, she felt it deep in her chest, the quiet beauty of connection. The predator race that had once lived only for conquest now understood peace. All because one human had chosen to brush her hair in the dark. Years passed, and the seasons on Threxia came and went like slow-breathing waves. The moons shifted, the storms grew softer, and the human scientist who had once been a stranger became part of the planet's history. Elena grew older, her hair now touched with silver, her steps slower but still steady. She had spent so many years among the Kareth that her presence no longer felt foreign. The cubs she had once taught had grown into warriors, healers, and leaders. They still came to her cabin sometimes, not as students, but as friends. They spoke with her about the stars, about Earth, about the strange ways of humankind, and every evening, before they left, they brushed their scales in silence, a habit that no one questioned anymore. When the time came for Elena to return to Earth, the entire village gathered to see her off. The air was filled with a quiet sadness, the kind that comes when someone dear is leaving, not forever, but far enough to be missed. The children brought her flowers from the Red Valley. The elders offered her small relics as a sign of gratitude. But she carried little with her, only her research notes, her memories, and her old wooden hairbrush. It had been her companion since the first day she arrived, a small piece of home that had somehow become a symbol of peace in an alien world. Before she left, she walked to the Kareth's Hall of Memory, a great stone chamber where they kept the relics of their history. The first spear carved by their ancestors, the star maps that guided their ships, the banners from ancient wars. She stood before the great table in the center, surrounded by the elders, and gently placed the brush upon it. Its wooden handle was worn smooth from years of use, its bristles slightly frayed but still strong. "This," she said softly, "belongs here, not with me." The high elder stepped forward, his deep eyes reflecting both pride and sorrow. "It is a small thing," he said, "yet it changed everything." Together they placed it inside a glass case. Beneath it, they carved an inscription in both their languages. "From the one who taught us that peace begins with a single gentle touch." When Elena's ship lifted off that evening, the Kareth stood in silence, watching the trail of light fade into the sky. They didn't wave or call out. They simply stood, heads bowed, holding their brushes like a quiet salute. Generations later, long after Elena's name had faded from Earth's memory, the Kareth still practiced the ritual. Before hunts, before battles, before great decisions, they brushed their scales in silence, reflecting on calm and purpose. The act no longer belonged to a human. It belonged to them, to who they had become. In the Hall of Memory, the wooden brush still rested under soft light, unchanged by time. To outsiders it might look ordinary, but to the Kareth, it was sacred. The symbol of the moment they learned that even the fiercest hearts could be touched by gentleness. And so, a simple human habit had bridged two worlds forever,